Henry of Monmouth was born in Wales in September 1386, the eldest son of Henry Bolingbroke and his first wife, Mary de Bohun. Henry of Monmouth was born shortly before the merciless Parliament of 1388, which saw the removal from power of many unpopular members of the government of King Richard II. The group of nobles who brought this about are known as the Lords Appellant, of which Henry Bolingbroke was a leading member. In the following decade, Richard II would seek his revenge against his cousin Bolingbroke and the other lords, with Bolingbroke sent into exile in 1398. Richard took young Henry of Monmouth into his custody. The king treated Henry well, which the latter would remember later in life. Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt, died in 1399, and now the Duchy of Lancaster should have passed to his father, Bolingbroke. With Bolingbroke in exile, Richard seized the lucrative duchy for himself. Taking Henry of Monmouth with him, Richard then inexplicably sailed to Ireland, allowing Bolingbroke to land in England and seize not only his inheritance, but also the English crown. Richard was captured whilst floundering in Wales, and he was eventually starved to death at Pontefract Castle. Henry of Monmouth was now a prince and heir to his father's crown. His childhood hadn't been easy. His mother Mary had died when he was only 7, and he had seen his father banished, with himself becoming a royal hostage, albeit a well-treated one. But he was made of tough stuff, as he would demonstrate during his father's reign. In 1403, Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, had to deal with the rebellion of Henry Percy, better known to history as Harry Hotspur. King Henry triumphed at the Battle of Shrewsbury, where Hotspur was killed, but the royal victory very nearly came at a terrible price. Prince Henry, just 16 years old and fighting in his first battle, was struck underneath his right eye by an arrow whilst in the thick of the fighting. The arrow was removed and Henry survived, but he was left with a terrible scar. Despite the victory in battle, life continued to be hard for King Henry IV, as plots and rebellions continued to be formed against him. One of the most persistent problems came in the shape of Owen Glyndŵr in Wales. In 1405, Henry IV executed Richard le Scrope, Archbishop of York, for joining the plots of the Earl of Northumberland, Harry Hotspur's father. Executing an archbishop was controversial to say the least, and did little for the king's public image. Henry continued to campaign against the Percy family in the north, forcing the Earl to flee to France in 1406. It was around the time of Le Scrope's execution that Henry IV started to become ill with a disease that would plague him for the rest of his life. Generally, it's believed Henry had developed leprosy, and some put his illness down to the wrath of God after the execution of the Archbishop. As Henry's health declined, his heir, now fast maturing, would begin to take a more prominent role in the king's government. In 1410, a blacksmith was arrested for heresy. He had publicly and doggedly been denying the ritual of the body of Christ as practiced during Mass. He was imprisoned at Smithfield, where he received a royal visitor. This was Prince Henry, who had heard about the case. Whilst it's likely Henry felt strongly opposed to what the man had been preaching, it's also likely that he saw an opportunity to prove himself to be a worthy king. His father was gravely ill, and here was a chance for the prince to demonstrate not only his piety, but also his ability to demonstrate both leniency and justice. Henry pleaded with the man to recant his views, but he found that there was nothing he could do to change his mind. The blacksmith was ordered to be burned. As the flames were lit, the heretic cried out in agonized pain. Still, Henry tried to spare him. He ordered the fire to be eased and promised to pardon the heretic and even pay him a pension from the royal exchequer. But despite his terrible plight, the heretic continued to be defiant and point blank refused the offer. He died a miserable death. But for Prince Henry, this had been an excellent PR move for him. Henry had clearly demonstrated that even the most blatant of criminal would still be able to find forgiveness when the time came for him to be king, should they be repentant. If not, then he certainly would not shy away from meting out justice. It seems clear by now, with Henry aged about 24, that he viewed himself ready for kingship, and it would probably have been apparent to many others at the time as well that the country needed a new and healthy ruler. And up until 1412, Prince Henry did indeed become the dominant figure in government as he interfered in a dispute in France between the Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy. However, there was one important man who was not happy at the prince's increasing power, and that was the king himself. In 1412, the health of Henry IV was just about good enough that he began to regain control over his kingdom, and he reversed his son's decision to side with the Burgundians. Still, Prince Henry was not to be put off, and he had good reason for it. The king was described as being horribly disfigured, and on appearance, at least, he looked quite unfit to rule. Supported by many of the nobles, the prince urged the king to lay down the crown and retire, but Henry IV determinedly refused. As if to prove a point, he then did a tour of the country on horseback and even made plans for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. However, this was purely fanciful, and the king's health would never allow it. Eventually, the old king died and was buried at Canterbury Cathedral. The time for Henry of Monmouth had finally come. He was now King Henry V. Henry V was a tall, athletic man who was incredibly fleet of foot. An Italian writer tells how Henry would, whilst out hunting, compete in a race with two friends to catch a deer on foot. Using both his speed and guile, Henry would always come out on top. His interests were conventional for a prince of his time, with hunting and music prominent amongst them. Henry was crowned king on the 9th of April 1413 at Westminster Abbey by the Archbishop of Canterbury and York, Thomas Arundel. The weather on the day of the coronation was atrocious, as rain, snow, and hail hammered down and continued for the next 2 days after. This made life miserable for curious onlookers, as visibility was virtually non existent. In a show of gratitude towards God, Henry built religious houses near the River Thames, naming them Bethlehem and Zion. He also set about rebuilding Sheen Palace, which had been torn down by the grief stricken Richard II after his wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died there in 1394. Henry then ordered the body of Richard himself to be moved from King's Langley in Hertfordshire to the more regal surroundings of Westminster Abbey and into the tomb that Richard had prepared for himself. This was one final act of gratitude for the king that he had spent so much time with in his youth, and perhaps also to draw a line under his father's controversial claiming of the crown. The king also sought to make peace with another ghost from the recent past. He recalled to England from Scotland the exiled son of Harry Hotspur, another Henry, who was allowed to reclaim the title of Earl of Northumberland. Despite taking such measures to try and ensure peace in his kingdom, Henry V, who clearly had his eyes set on France, found himself having another sort of war at home, one that he had experience with already. This was a war against heresy. This particular heresy came in the form of the Lollards, who, like other medieval movements, contradicted conventional and traditional Catholic beliefs. During a Lollard meeting at Haringey Park in London, the king's men marched on them, killing some and scattering the rest. One of the leaders, Sir John Oldcastle, had been a friend of Henry's, and, despite his religious views, the king was reluctant to prosecute Sir John. That changed when Sir John involved himself in a plot to overthrow Henry. He was eventually captured and executed in horrible fashion. Hanged till unconscious, Sir John was revived and disemboweled. He was then put in a cage and burned to ashes. The ugly scenes with the Lollard persecutions had been an unwelcome distraction for Henry. He needed to strengthen his grip on power. Despite being obviously charismatic, Henry's position as king was a relatively fragile one. His father, as I mentioned, had been a usurper and paid the price with a reign riddled with rebellions. Henry V was desperate to avoid that. One thing that would help his cause would be to make a marriage alliance with a foreign superpower, and who better to turn to than the Kingdom of France? Henry sent ambassadors to the court of Charles VI, asking to marry Charles's daughter, Catherine. The meeting did not go well. The French king suffered from severe mental health issues, and his advisers were contemptuous of both Henry's embassy and Henry himself. They mocked Henry's supposed youth, despite the fact he was approaching his late 20s, by offering to send him little tennis balls to play with. Unsurprisingly, Henry was not amused. He swore revenge. The king made preparations for war. He ordered the making of swords, shields, arrows, and armour. Experts were called from across the kingdom to design and make huge siege engines. Henry gathered together a huge fleet, and by the summer of 1415 he was ready to set sail on the campaign that was destined to set his name down in history as one of the great military commanders of his generation, and perhaps of any generation. But he was delayed. Another plot had been uncovered. This was known as the Southampton Plot, which aimed to put a man named Edmund Mortimer on the throne in place of Henry. Edmund, however, wanted nothing to do with the plot, and instead informed Henry at once and pleaded his innocence. The ringleaders were captured and executed. This was another example of Henry's vulnerability, but it also demonstrates that he was a man and a king who commanded and inspired loyalty. That quality would come in handy in his campaigns in France. Henry's army first laid siege to Harfleur in Normandy, but came into difficulties, and the sort of difficulties that many medieval armies encountered: disease. The English were afflicted with dysentery, which wiped out countless numbers of fighting men throughout the Middle Ages, and would, in 1422, kill Henry V himself. Many succumbed, and some even had to return home. Despite this, Henry, after a few weeks, captured Harfleur. From there, the English king decided that he would march on Calais. However, he was intercepted by a huge French army that contained all the flower of the French nobility. On the 25th of October 1415, the English and French met at the Battle of Agincourt. Henry, clad in fair and stunning armour, chose his battle lines carefully. Knowing he was massively outnumbered, Henry knew his archers would be crucial. As we know well now, the battle was a stunning success for the English, one of the greatest in all military history. The French, overconfident in their vastly superior numbers, were cut down in their thousands. The English fought with a fierce determination that could only be produced by men loyal to their king. Whilst doubts may have existed about Henry's right to rule, his victory at Agincourt had unquestionably proved he was worthy of the crown. Having returned to England as a conquering hero, Henry welcomed a special visitor to his court, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who hoped to broker a peace between Henry and the French. A council was held in 1416, but little headway was made, despite the emperor's best efforts. Some attribute this to obstinacy on the part of the French, but it seems more likely that despite pretenses of wanting peace, Henry had no such intention of coming to terms with the French. They had, after all, insulted him personally, and he had routed them in revenge. Henry now surely had his eyes set on conquest. In 1417, the French determined that they would reclaim Harfleur. For them, this was vital, as it would serve as a perfect landing point for Henry as and when he decided to launch another invasion of France. In response, Henry sent his brother, John, Duke of Bedford, with a fleet, and the siege was broken and the French scattered. Henry himself then sailed for Normandy. After a long and difficult siege, Henry finally took Rouen. The citizens had suffered terribly with starvation and famine, but it was a crucial success, and Normandy came under his control. By now, the prospect of Henry conquering all of France was becoming all the more real. The French were terribly divided, and Henry V was just the man to exploit that division. In 1420, ambassadors representing the mad King Charles approached Henry in order to sue for peace. Represented in the negotiations by Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, who was described as being of excellent worth and who had learnt much from Henry's instruction, Henry finally got his desired marriage to Catherine, Charles's daughter. On hearing of Warwick's excellent work in the negotiations, Henry was delighted, but he still had to travel to Troyes in order to formalise the arrangements. Henry first travelled to Paris, where he made a point of parading his soldiers outside the city walls. This was no mere arrangement of a medieval marriage, this was a conquest. Henry was presenting himself to the French as their prospective king. The Treaty of Troyes was signed, and Henry was made the legal heir of Charles VI. On the 3rd of June 1420, Henry finally married Catherine of Valois. With her, he'd have one son. This son was named after his father and was born in December 1421. Henry's rise to power in France had been absolutely astonishing. When he came to the throne in England, his position had been weak. The successor to a usurper, Henry was unmarried and without any heirs to secure his position. But just 7 years later, he now stood on the brink of uniting the French and English crowns, having bullied the French into submission. Resistance to Henry continued after the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, though. For many Frenchmen, the treaty was nothing but a weak capitulation to a foreign invader. After Troyes, Henry turned his attention to areas where rebellion continued. He captured Melun, Sens, and Montereau. Once again, delighted with his work, Henry returned to England, a conquering hero, this time accompanied by his new bride. The birth of his son at the end of 1421 had been further welcome news for the king, but there were problems now on the horizon for Henry. His conquest of France was not complete, nor would it ever be. After years of campaigning, men and resources were now running low, and Henry himself was beginning to suffer the effects of a lifetime of campaigning. During the siege of Meaux, Henry began to fall ill with dysentery. He developed a fever, and it soon became clear to both Henry and his doctors that he would not recover. For the English, his death was a disaster. There was only a baby, not yet one, to succeed him. For the French, worn down by conflict with Henry and their own internal problems, it was a massive relief. Despite English claims to the contrary, even up until the reign of Henry VIII, France would never be conquered by the English, despite coming perilously close to doing so. The death of Henry V is one of history's great what ifs. How would he have managed both England and France? It seems an unlikely prospect that he would have succeeded, but if any king could have done it, it would have been Henry V. From unpromising beginnings, he inspired the loyalty of his subjects. Military speaking, he was a genius. Ruthless, yet he knew how to maintain peace in the realms that he did govern. He was a quite remarkable king and brilliant man.